Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am going to be doing another individual movie review, this time for the movie Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, directed by Jonathan M. Goldstein and John Francis Daley. Now, if you've not heard of those directors' names before, then maybe you have heard of the movie Game Night, which came out a couple years ago, a movie that I absolutely loved for how clever it was. In fact, it was one of my top 10 movies of the year that it came out, and I still appreciate it now. I like that recently on social media, maybe just because of the release of this movie with the directors' names being in public spaces again, that it seems to be getting reevaluated and reappreciated, with a lot of people calling it an underrated masterwork, and I would generally agree with that. When I heard that they were going to be directing the new Dungeons & Dragons movie, I definitely became a lot more interested in this movie than I was before. Admittedly, the trailers did look a little cheesy to me, but I try not to let trailers cloud my judgment too much, and I went into this movie with an open mind, especially considering the talent that was behind it, with also a cast that seemed to be pretty charming. So, what did we get out of this movie that is based on the famous game that so many people play these days? Well, let's talk about it. So, Dungeons & Dragons centers around a group of adventurers who sort of band together to take on a heist to retrieve a lost relic that the main character is needing for a very personal reason. But things go wrong when they run into the wrong people, and this basically is the way that the movie is bringing the role-playing game to life in a big screen format. And generally, I was pleasantly surprised by this movie. I mean, I was already getting pretty surprised by the sheer amount of positive reviews it was getting from both critics and audiences alike, which is what made me even more wanting to go see this movie than I already was. But I can see why so many people like this. It is a crowd-pleasing movie to the extreme, I would say. I think this movie actually does a very good job at honoring the fantasy genre in ways that we haven't really gotten to see on the big screen in a long time. I would unfortunately say that fantasy on the big screen is a bit of a dying genre, as it is one of the more expensive to make with all the world building and design you have to do, but nevertheless, I am always hopeful that there will be new fantasy stuff, and I think this movie does that very well. I think I was a little worried that maybe it would be populated by a lot of cheap CGI and just a lot of fake-looking effects, but while there are some of those moments in this movie, they're not really as much as you might expect from a movie like this. The beginning of this movie almost made it look like it was on a Game of Thrones level budget, which is pretty impressive to think about, but nevertheless, I do think that this movie does honor the fantasy genre very well, and you have a lot of really cool worlds. I think it's visually very appealing, and they take advantage of a lot of different locations. It also does help that at the center of this is a cast that I feel is generally pretty charming with not many flaws there. Chris Pine is great as main character Edgin, and is definitely the best part of this movie by far. He is definitely playing a sort of likable everyman, but he is also very funny. He sort of reminds me of Han Solo in a way, if Han Solo was in a more medieval fantasy film, but I say that as a compliment. I really like him in this movie. I think he is an easy character to attach onto. Surprisingly enough, I also really liked Justice Smith as Simon. I say surprisingly because I've not really liked Justice Smith in any role I've seen him in. I recently talked about Sharper on my channel with my quick movie reviews, and I did not really care for him in that movie. And I haven't cared for him at all in the Jurassic Park movies, but he is probably at his best here. I think the movie let him cut loose a little bit, and you could tell he was more relaxed in this type of role. He was able to be a little bit silly, and I think his comedy generally worked. I also think he might have had one of the more fun characters to deal with, as he was able to use magic, but was also a little incompetent at it, and I think he had a fun arc with that in finding his confidence. That worked pretty well, and I think a lot of people will really like seeing. But I would debate that the characters who had the most fun, or rather the actors who had the most fun characters to deal with, were Sophia, Lillis, and Rege Jean Page as Zinc and Doric. Doric in particular was a very fun character to watch as a shapeshifter, and I appreciate that the directors took advantage of the shapeshifting ability and made her change into different animals consistently. They didn't just keep the same types of animals that she was turning into, and they used her shapeshifting ability quite creatively. And Zinc was a pretty fun character too, as someone who is just this very jack-of-all-trades swordsman and had probably the best action scene in the film. We can't go without talking about Hugh Grant either, who was also a pretty big highlight, probably my second favorite after Chris Pine's role. You can tell that he's having a lot of fun as Forge, and I appreciate that he really embraces the cartoonishness of his character. He plays into the over-the-top nature this character has, and a lot of people are going to appreciate that, and I just think it really fits in with the vibe that this world has. He is definitely one of the most fun here. Now, as far as weaker performances go, I wouldn't say that they're bad by any means, but Michelle Rodriguez is basically playing her typical action hero shtick as Holga. I do appreciate they give her a couple of more different things to do here, but they're also trying to sort of make her the heart of the movie in some ways, and I'm not sure it works quite as well as the directors are wanting it to. And Daisy Head is pretty underwhelming as the main villain, Sophia. The villain, Sophia, feels especially weird in this movie, considering all the other characters are playing pretty over the top generally, or playing their characters more cartoonish-like, but Sophia is just this very generic villain, so she feels like she doesn't belong even more, just considering how different the rest of the cast is acting around her, and she's pretty underwhelming and not as menacing as she could be. But let's talk about some other positives of the movie while we're on this route. I think the action in this movie is pretty strong. I really like the combination of just common sword action along with the magic action. I think it creates for some very fun scenes, and once again, I do think they stay consistently creative with it. I also think that the comedy in this movie is pretty solid. There were a lot of moments where I was laughing, and while it wasn't as funny or clever as Game Night, I do think the laughs in here generally worked. If there were any weaknesses besides that I would have to give to this movie, I would say that definitely the exposition dumps were a huge one. I do think that this movie might be a little exposition heavy in some parts. I understand that's part of the nature of this movie, especially with something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and I feel like they were trying to appeal to a more general audience besides just the Dungeons and Dragons fans. As someone who is not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons hardly at all, I did generally understand what was going on in this story, but I feel like the movie does halt several times to do the exposition dumps. Even with those exposition dumps, I appreciate that the story stayed fairly accessible and something that was generally easy to follow along with. I also do think that maybe the movie becomes a little faltering in the ending parts. After the arena scene where these characters are playing in a game, which is really good, there's this climactic action fight that doesn't feel as energetic as it could have, and I feel like they really could have been more creative there, where there had been a lot more creative action fights in the earlier scenes with a combination of magic and sword fighting and all that stuff. The climactic battle just didn't feel as energetic as it could have, in my opinion, and it felt like it was taking place in a fairly boring location too, just in the town square. This movie I still did really like. I was pleasantly surprised by this. This is way better than I expected it to be, and maybe even better than it had a right to be, but I also don't necessarily agree with that because there are two talented directors on the creation of this movie, and I think they did a great job with it, and this proves that they are here to stay and that they are going to continue to do creative things. I'd be open to a sequel for this movie because I really enjoyed this, and I always like seeing more fantasy in the mainstream. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for this movie. I would definitely recommend it. So yeah, those were my thoughts on the newest Dungeons & Dragons movie. What were your thoughts on it if you've seen it? Let me know in the comments. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.